Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to moderate our discussion today, focusing on the role of research in redefining success. My name is Tatiana Carey, and I work for Ashoka in the UK and Ireland, leading our search for new Ashoka Fellows. Alongside my work at Ashoka, I'm a feminist researcher and a PhD candidate in social policy at the University of Edinburgh, where my research focuses on elite philanthropy, power, and social change. And as such, I couldn't be more thrilled to be exploring this topic with all of you today at the intersection of research and impact. So existing norms of success often focus on metrics that emphasize the countable and quantifiable, such as the number of people impacted or the number of beneficiaries. And I'm sure for many of you that have been able to participate in other aspects of the summit, well, maybe you've already heard what WISER, or the Women's Initiative for Social Entrepreneurship, will call that as scaling out. At the same time, impact relating to changing mindsets or influencing laws or policy, what WISE would call scaling deep or scaling up, is more complex to measure and is often uncounted and thus unacknowledged or even ignored. And the consequences of this can mean that certain types of impact and social change are sidelined and made invisible. This can result in both gendered and racialized disparities in resourcing certain types of social change, further perpetuating inequalities. And this phenomenon leaves us with many questions. So who gets to decide what counts as impact? How have historical positions of knowledge production meant that certain types of ideas or certain people are made more visible or invisible? Who leads on research and who gets to shape research questions and agendas? And how do we even begin to destabilize these embedded power and knowledge structures? And so in this session, we wish for leaders at the intersection of academia, research, activism, and entrepreneurship to identify tangible next steps for us to change how we measure and understand scaling and impact. What role can academia and research play in lending legitimacy and credibility to different types of social change? And so to cover this topic and probably more, today we're joined by Ghada Borsum, the chair of Department of Public Policy and Administration at the American University in Cairo. Priya Iyer, Associate Director of the Social Entrepreneurship Program at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Hatla, I hope I got that right. Loga Datter, Co-Founder and Director at the Arctic Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. I don't think we have Hibak here yet, so maybe we'll be joined by Hibak Osman, Founder and CEO of El Karama, so stay tuned. And then lastly, we're joined by Regina Honu, Ashoka Fellow and CEO of Soronko Academy. So I'll begin our discussion by asking each of our panelists a question where they can also introduce themselves further. And then we'll open up to a more open discussion between everyone. So I thought probably I would start with Priya, if that's all right. As the Associate Director of Social Entrepreneurship Program, you advise students in launching mission-driven social ventures. Given this experience, what would you recommend as a starting point for academic entrepreneurship programs to change how they teach and measure impact?
That's a really good question. And I apologize, I didn't realize the sun was going to hit my face exactly in this angle this morning, so I hope you can see me okay. I can start out with kind of what brought me to this work, because I think it ties into your question really well. So in my own experience, I actually launched a venture around health, iron deficiency anemia for women who are low income in India's slum areas. And that's kind of how I started out my work in social entrepreneurship. So I thought a lot about scaling deep and behavior change. And I found that when I was working on something like that, it wasn't necessarily sexy to funders, it wasn't easy to sell, but it really wasn't just about health. A lot of that was about behavior change, thinking about how women would value themselves, how other people in their community would value women, and how their families would value them. So it was much more than something that I think was really tangibly measurable, which is what funders often want. And because of my own struggle, I think in communicating those kinds of short-term, neat and glamorous metrics that I find are often what funders want. And I was thinking more about long-term changes. It got me thinking about this more deeply, I think. And that's kind of what brought me to my current role, which is where I support students who are launching social ventures in health, education, environment across different domain areas. And I'm fortunate that we work with a disproportionate percentage of women actually in our programs, and I've seen a lot of the challenges that they face around fundraising and around selling specific ideas to funders who are of a dominant culture and don't necessarily understand those ideas and the struggles they go through with that. So for me, I think what we do is we ground in teaching the theory of change first to our social entrepreneurs. So this is the idea that if you're not familiar with it, that you have inputs and you think through how that leads to particular behavior change. And I think that's a great way to start, but I think that's a very iterative process. And we often think of impact as an end product rather than the complete process. And I think that that's really, really important to kind of shift that mindset in academic settings, to like really focus on the fact that impact is not linear and reaching that impact is not linear. And so as students iterate on their products, I would love to see this theory of change also being an iterative process as well, for one. Another thing is, I think during the process, we often come in as external people and do user research or human-centered design. I would love to see communities being paid to do their own design work and being trained to do their own design work. And I think that's part of the process of impact. Now, the flip side is that makes everything much slower, but I think that's okay. I think there's this, you know, where we sit, there's a Silicon Valley idea that you're supposed to do everything quickly and break everything. And I don't think that works with social ventures. And so I think really, you know, working with the community means training communities, paying communities, and taking the work slow, and that's okay. And like one example of that would be I work with an organization that's trying to make childcare more affordable, right? And so instead of the students interviewing nannies, I think that it would be great if they trained and embedded nannies to do that user research themselves, because how different would the findings look? How different would the research look? And so this idea of distributed design, I think, is one big thing they can do. And then I'll just mention two more things and would love to hear thoughts from the other panelists as well. But I think a second thing that I would love to see is to make it easier for women to take risks. And this, in our context, would be underrepresented women of color in particular. And so that means that we move away from this mentality of like starving ourselves because we're starting nonprofits or social ventures, or that people shouldn't pay themselves salaries, but really kind of centering ourselves and realizing that the power comes in that. And although these things, again, are about process, I think they're very tied into impact. And I think that it's about centering the people who are closest to the problems and empowering them to solve these problems. And then the last thing I would mention is I just think that we really need a paradigm shift around using the amount of funding someone raises as a proxy for impact, because it certainly isn't. And that's kind of around the framework of scaling out. Scaling out isn't just about how much funding you raise. It's much, much deeper than that. So I'll stop there. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be on this panel.
Thank you, Priya. I loved your phrasing of neat and glamorous metrics as being part of the problem. That's very succinct. Ghada, I might go to you next. Your research has focused primarily on education and employment in Egypt and the systemic barriers that reproduce inequality along gender and class lines. In your opinion, what is missing when it comes to measuring success and impact?
Thank you, Tatiana. It's really an honor to be part of this panel. And I'd like to focus this on women, on just research on women and research by women in terms of impact and leadership. And I'll start with research on women. And I just, what I've written and years of writing on women's empowerment, women's employment. And I find that most of the time we focus on the poor and the disenfranchised. And it's because we believe in the role of research as a tool for advocacy. We believe in our role in research can be used for advocating for social equity. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is fantastic. We need this. We need more research that shows the voices of the poor and disenfranchised. The problem is we're just ending up with so many sad stories, just so many of those. And we're unable to see women's power. We're unable to see women's leadership, women in leadership position. And it becomes more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just recently, post the pandemic, if there's anything good about the pandemic, it's just, there's, more research or just research starting to see what is happening with countries with women leaders. Why are these countries or at one point still showing less of the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? How could these countries, why were these countries more effective or more agile in their policies and just focus on women as leaders? So I think we need to do more of that. We need to just think of go beyond our sad stories, the stories we've been writing and telling all the time. And not that we need to stop voicing these people, but we also need to take note or take into account women in leadership position, and not just limit our definition of leadership to high profile state level leadership, but leadership in communities, leadership in social entrepreneurs, fantastic people you're bringing here. And women are movers and shakers in every community, and we need to be able to see that and acknowledge that. So that's one thing I wanted to focus on when it comes to research on women. I could go on and talk about research by women, which is the other challenge. And everybody who's in this field of academia would know the challenges that women face, especially if you are a woman in the global south, because this is the double wedge. Women in academia, they face globally. There's global evidence that women in academia face discrimination at hiring, promotion, and evaluation. And for research to strive, you need to be part of an institution. You need funding, you need support, you need an institutional base that would give you the time and motivation to continue with your research. So when you don't have strong institutions, that's the double wedge of being in the global south, because there is very limited support to research in general. And that's why you're ending up with fewer women doing research, or fewer women doing recognizable research with an impact, research that's published in places that's read by others, not just in the gray literature area where you're seeing those fantastic reports that go nowhere. I just want to stop at that and just give you my thoughts on these two aspects of women in academia, women as a subject of research and women as researchers. And thank you again for this invitation.
Thank you. I love that idea of, how do we do research that helps to build power? I think is a very provoking question. Regina, I might go to you next, if that's all right. As the founder and CEO of a leading technology and digital skills development center, you might have to mute.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll get my question out and then I'll mute myself. I think we have a bit of feedback on it. So as the founder and CEO of a leading technology and digital skills development center, you are cultivating the next generation of leaders and innovators through alternative paths of education. In your opinion, how can traditional academic institutions better include all forms of learning and research conducted on women and education?
Thank you, Tatiana, for that question. I'm going to preface it first with something that even happened this morning, which was I got a call from the University of Mines and Technology Computer Science Department, and they were saying that they were struggling to connect their graduates to the job market, right? And this is the challenge that we see in academia And also, so you have academic institutions saying we graduate brilliant students, but they cannot connect to jobs. And then you have the job market saying we're looking for talent, but we cannot find talent. And then you add the gender piece to it, because then you have organizations saying we're looking for diversified teams, but we cannot find women that are confident, can assert themselves, and can bring value. So for me, I think you have to approach it in two ways in terms of education, where you're looking at the technical skills and the soft skills, especially when you're doing different programs for women and girls. With the soft skills, it's really important that you build that in the curriculum, whereby you are working against years of social conditioning and years of women having to hear that this is your place or this is your box, and not really connecting with the subject matter, because mostly you have a lot of male teachers that teach certain courses and they are speaking mostly, you know, to the male students, or the content matter not being practical. So when it's very heavy on theory, it's hard to relate, it's hard to connect, and women really like to see the pieces come together so that they can see the whole picture. And so I'm always advocating that education doesn't have to be that one, you know, you have a teacher, the body store of knowledge, just teaching. It should be interactive, it should be engaging, it should push the students to question information and question the status quo. We want young people that can sit there and say, okay, we've been doing this for a very long time, how can we try a different approach? And failure should be encouraged such that you learn from that experience. I think there's so many institutions where failure is seen as you failed, this is the consequence, and that's it. You know, how can we teach that it's okay to keep trying, even though maybe the first attempt didn't work, the second attempt didn't work, just keep pushing, just keep putting out. So how do we create these different courses and programs? So at the Academy, one of the things that we do and we push is different human-centered design programs, also different courses, but it's important that it ties to the market's need. So now that's the last piece I'm going to also put in. Academic or academia should now move in with the market need. It's not enough to train just to train. At the end of the day, the beneficiaries must say, like, we're training for this market, or we understand that these are the needs of the market, or we understand that this is where the market is going. So let's bring in these courses. So outmoded curriculum or ways of doing things that is not catching up, you know, with the way things are moving now, have to change. And there should be room for adaptability. Nobody could have predicted COVID-19, and schools immediately switched to online. EdTech took off. So how adaptable, you know, our academic institutions, how adaptable our learning institutions to be able to quickly switch or move over when an unexpected occurrence happens. So this is why we always champion for digital inclusion and making sure that people are thinking outside the box in terms of the programs that they're running.
Thank you, Regina. Ooh, you might have to mute. Sorry, keep having to make you mute yourself. I think a lot of what you mentioned actually fits in with what Priya was already mentioning earlier about risk, and what Hada was saying about, you know, who's in the room, who's doing the teaching, and what hierarchies come in within that setting. So last but certainly not least, Hatla, as founder of the Arctic Innovation Lab and director of the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School, you have led essential research into the future of the Arctic, especially as it relates to climate change and innovation. You also founded the Girls for Girls nonprofit, a global mentorship program to encourage young women to enter public leadership. As you operate in both the philanthropic and academic ecosystems, what is your recommendation for mobilizing the research sector to redefine success and redesign its systems for measuring impact?
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for this question, and thanks for inviting me. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be here with all of you. I'm actually calling in from Iceland. I've been here for several months during COVID, and I can just share with you that we had an eruption starting next to the city a couple of days ago. So I'm feeling very energetic, literally, to be here with that eruption here in our backyard. But there have been so many interesting and important points already mentioned. But I want to say, in the context of your question, is that first and foremost, to channel resources to the right directions, we have to make sure that women have a seat at the table. And in terms of research, the bigger the role is, the better in terms of channeling resources into the right projects, whether it's research or social innovation or entrepreneurship projects and so forth. So then it brings us to the question, how to get that seat at the table. And I want to bring up, because so many points have been mentioned here already, one element that is always so obvious, but I feel like we always need to bring it into the debate. And that is the importance of having courage and building courage. And I say that because I think it's particularly challenging for many communities, for many women. Priya mentioned the struggle of fundraising. Gada mentioned the institutional environment, having access to healthcare, having the support network and environment to be able to seek forward and get seat at the table is not always easy. So how do we then build the courage and maintain the courage? Well, one of the key ingredients for that, I believe, is having access to a support system, having access to allies, mentors, and so forth. So these were some of the ideas that made us fund the project that you mentioned, Project Girls for Girls, where we have skill-based sessions on different things from negotiations to public speaking. But we also have mentors from different industries, from the business community that you mentioned, Regina, to politicians and everything in between, that meet young women and go through different challenges and help build that courage, help say, okay, you can do this, these are some advices for this situation, and so forth. And the project we've seen now, we're operating now in over 20 countries. We've seen how much worth it is for communities in different countries to mirror and seek support and also frame research questions together. And one good example of that is that Iceland is now working with Uganda. Project Girls for Girls in Iceland is now working with Project Girls for Girls in Uganda on looking into the question, how comes that in both countries we have quotas, in Iceland for board membership, so women quotas, how many women need to be on boards. And in Uganda, you have quotas of, related to public office in parliament. But still those quotas are not being fulfilled despite that we have them. So there's some elements missing. So it's an example of how this type of collaboration is also bringing forward interesting questions that really need to be answered and addressed in the bigger picture. Then the second thing, and maybe related to Priya's comments, because you have this incredible program at Stanford, and we in Cambridge are working along the same lines, thinking about how we can bring more people into the social innovation space. And I think it's becoming, we see in the number of programs that are being built around the world in this space, is that it's not only about the value of research itself, it's also the value of university contribution is also about the value of the student impact after graduation. And it's obvious when we think about the depth and the breadth of impact that, you know, we need those change makers, and women in that context are obvious. And if I speak from my perspective, my subject area, climate change, you know, women are a key part of the solution on all levels. You can't design the solution or implement it successfully without counting half of the population. So putting pressure on governments and donors and others to make sure that, as Priya, you said, that we're getting funding for those good innovations and entrepreneurship programs in academia, and working relentlessly towards building courage for women to seek forward despite having limited resources, despite having young children and so forth, are some insights and issues that I'd like to put forward. And I think I stop here for now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I guess now I'd like to open it a bit more for everyone to be able to exchange a bit more openly. And I guess also an invitation to anyone who is on the chat to put in any questions there, and we can try and integrate them, or different panelists can try and integrate them in their answers. But maybe kind of a general one to kick you all off would just be around, there's obviously loads of different challenges and many of them insurmountable. But kind of going back to what you've already started touching on, what are some of the practical ways that you're going through this in your work, in your day-to-day? Or are there any low-hanging fruit you see as entryways for other people joining the call that they might be able to integrate these types of efforts into their own work?
Yes, maybe I'll start. And I think one of the good rule is just being intentional. In the case of the Arctic Initiative, for an example, we just designed our policies around, how we're going to go about recruitments, how we're going to be thinking about our engagement in general. And I think the intentionality is very important for the journey itself.
So I also wanted to say, as a female social entrepreneur working in technology, there are several challenges, and then I'll talk a little bit about the challenge and a little bit about the opportunity. So when it comes to the challenge, just like you're saying, you have a lot of funders that are looking at numbers and would like you to reach a certain target. But then what happens is that you need to do a deeper dive. So an example is, we teach coding skills at the academy, but we realized that for some of the women, they had gone through some trauma that they didn't have outlets to talk about. So we had to integrate e-counseling into our program. So that took some more time, because you can't train somebody who's broken. And so you would have people that would say, oh, reach more people. But then we're like, no, what is the impact at the end of the day? You have to really take your time and do a deeper dive. Or you have some women that probably can't complete the program because, they have household chores or don't have access to the cost of data and laptops. So then we have to join that conversation. So we spend more time going around all the different hurdles that we may not necessarily be able to just do 100 or 1,000. And even if we do 100 or 1,000, to what end? What is the tangible output at the end? So for us, we're always bringing funders back to the fact that, look, the number is nice on paper, but what is the true impact on the ground? And when there's that true impact on the ground, there's that domino effect. Because when we hear the impact stories of what some of the women are doing, we are amazed. I mean, some of the doors that they are opening and some of the other opportunities that they are giving, not only to their family members, but to communities around them. In terms of the opportunity space, now that I spoke about the challenge, is to keep advocating. I always say that if, we have a lot more women still saying that it's important that we do that deep dive. It's important that, we have a longer term impact as opposed to maybe a short term nice figure on your annual report that you trained or impacted 10,000 people. The question is, where are those people? What is the true impact? We will see that tangible results and we'll move the needle, especially in the social enterprise space, because we see a lot of organizations working in that space, but the impact is very minimal. And you ask yourself, maybe they should look at their approach. Maybe it's not just about the numbers, but what is that tangible impact and how are you doing monitoring and evaluation in the right way? And also, how are you tracking that impact and finding out what didn't work, what worked, and then how do you bring that back? So you have to, especially women and girls, you have to keep on it and do a deeper dive for true sustainable impact, or else it's just a nice number. But when you go back and check, the needle didn't move.
I can jump in. So one kind of obvious thing that we do, but that I think is really critical, is thinking about how we're integrating women into our lecturer positions, into our mentorship, into our judging, into every aspect of our program. And one big thing that we've done over the past year is create a DE&I strategy, but not just a strategy that kind of sits on a shelf, but something that we're translating into how do we transform who we're bringing in to actually support our, like all of our entrepreneurs, right? Because it's not just women entrepreneurs that should be mentored by women entrepreneurs. And so I think that's been really transformative and helps students from everything from, you know, the user research that they're doing to the fundraising to other aspects and the way that they can go about it.
I'm mesmerized by the wisdom in this room, this virtual room. It's not a real room. We are in different continents, probably. I really like the idea of women as mentors. I really love the idea that we need to be able to recognize the voice of women, not just, again, I would repeat this, not just as the poor and disenfranchised, but women as powerful leaders and shakers and movers. I think this is more of a low-hanging tree. If I go back to Tatiana's question, just being able to celebrate that and not celebrate it in a form of a flavor of the month, but celebrate it in a way where you actually believe in it and where you actually allow the space for it to flourish and to play an active role. I would warn that we should not shy away from the language of impact. I would warn that we should be able to speak the same language, speak it in a form that would put our voices, make our voices heard, because I don't like us to self-isolate. I don't like us to say, well, this is how they're measuring impact. We're not going to do this. We're not going to look at the numbers. We have the numbers. We have to have the numbers. We have to have them right, and we have to have them in a way where we explain what are the numbers and what's behind the numbers. So I would just say that let's not adopt any self-defeating mechanisms in that form, but be vocal and powerful in terms of showing our impact the way we see it. It's not, I mean, I do research on youth employment programs, and you find interventions that do, you know, we've trained 5,000 people. Fantastic. What did you do? We had a YouTube program and we just showed, you know, one video on that. That's fantastic. Okay. But, you know, don't tell me you had an impact with that. I mean, tell me how you're measuring the impact of that. And at the same time, so it's not, people are extremely critical of just numbers without knowing what's behind the numbers. So let's keep the numbers, but know how to use them and how to use them to our to push for causes that support leadership in the right direction.
Yeah, that really aligns with a lot of what's been said before about, you know, what are numbers saying and what is the meaning behind those, and what are they actually telling us or not. And I think, yeah, Priya at the beginning talked about money as a kind of proxy for impact, which again, I think fits with a lot of the different ways that we, you know, how we decide something's worth or what has value or not in this space. Without being too self-serving, as my research is kind of focused in this area, but I would love to talk a bit more. Oh, you can hear my dog in the background. I would love to hear a bit more about kind of the role of funders and funding that you've all mentioned in this. And I think it's something within an academic space where you hear a lot of academic researchers talk about, well, this type of research doesn't get the funding, or it's not fundable, and so forth. And it's, again, something that I hear just as much in the kind of practitioner space as well. So do you have any examples or advice on the best ways to maybe push back or to find funders that are aligned with this type of way of measuring?
Go ahead.
I think the narrative is changing. As we have more and more of these conversations. You do have some funders that are very intentional. Probably they have tried the approach for some time and realized that, you know, it doesn't really work, so they want to do a deeper dive. You still have some that, you know, just are about checking a box. So we normally dub those the check the box funders, where, you know, it's really about, okay, maybe they have some money to do some engagements and it has to do something. And so once they check that box, that is really it. And when you try and advocate for more, to be able to do more, they're like, oh no, you know, we are just about this. And then when you try and say, no, but this would really make an impact, they're like, okay. So you have that conversation. So normally what I do is I try and see, so within, let's say, the budgets that they have, what can we do to drive impact? So I tell them to scale down the number so that it makes more sense, you know, so that we can do more. So instead of just saying, okay, let's do 1,000, I'm like, okay, these are some of the other barriers. And I think those key insights and learnings are also very essential. So we document a lot of our learnings to give us evidence, you know, so that they are coming from that perspective. I also think that some funders, without having local perspective or understanding how some things work, cannot really relate or get what you're trying to say. So it's important that you document learnings. It's important that you present them different cases and different pathways to the success or the impact that they also want to achieve. So we always engage that conversation where we show the learnings, we show what works, what doesn't work, and then we present them alternatives. And then we can bring some along. For those that are still adamant on checking the box, we find another partner. So, I mean, that is what we do here.
I agree with Regina. It's a matching process. You can't work with every donor. That's a rule. And I years working with donors, I see that there are two approaches that donors adopt. It's either they're being deductive. They start with the theory of change in their mind, and they say, this is what we're going to focus on. This is our call for proposals, and they're very strict on what they want. And you see other donors who are more inductive. They are more open to new ideas and ready to solicit some new ideas. And, you know, it's a lot of shades in between. But I think you always need to make the case. You always need to put your to put forward a case for support that's plausible, and you know, as Regina said, you can't work with all donors. There are donors who are out there not for the right, not for the same reasons that you're operating for. So you know, just wish them luck and work with other donors. Luckily there are others.
Yeah, just to build off of what Gata's saying, I think that's so spot on. We often coach our students and tell them, you know, you're doing due diligence on your donors and your funders, just like they're doing due diligence on you. So don't forget that. And the way, there isn't a secret sauce, I think, but I think the way that you communicate with your funders, you have to think about, does that resonate with them? And like, are they really impact driven? Because if you end up with funders that aren't supporting your mission, they're going to push you in a different direction. And then it's going to become really complicated for you. So it's better, it's not always easy, right, to say no, because then you're taking risk. And of course you need that money, but you're changing the direction and kind of the mission of your organization when you don't say no, I think. So it's critical, I think, to remember that.
Maybe to add just a few words from the government's perspective and the role of governments in all of this. I think one big change that we have seen in the Nordics and in Iceland, for an example, in the last few years, is that the government has been putting boundaries or has been defining in both research to universities, but also in innovation funding, that there needs to be a balance when it comes to gender issues and when it comes to who gets funding. So we have seen relatively big change in the last few years of how many women entrepreneurs and women researchers are getting funding from those governmental funds, because it's been a top-down decision. And that's a whole other different world from the private donors that operate, as Gara and Priya and Regina has already mentioned, have their own set of priorities.
I think that kind of bridging aspect, right, and alignment piece is one that's incredibly, that is incredibly difficult to imagine of how to start doing that. But I guess on another piece of this would be on what are the commitments that attendees or people watching, or for yourselves as well, or for even for myself, what are the commitments that we can make to advance some of these different initiatives in the way that the ecosystem measures and defines impact? So what are the ways that what advice would you almost give on how people can integrate this into their work, or maybe one thing that they can start doing to change what things look like for them differently on Monday, just for example? I don't want to pick on anyone, but I will.
I can jump in and start something. So I think one big piece of advice I give students is, it's not always easy, but I think it's okay to push back with funders. So if how they're talking about impact doesn't make sense to you, I'd say speak up. That's okay. So maybe they'll walk away, as we spoke about before, but that's not always problematic. But I feel like there's often a power dynamic, and if you don't speak up, that will continue to persist.
I couldn't agree more with what Priya says. I feel like for maybe those in the audience who have either started their social enterprise journey or are engaging with funders and are in this position where, the funder seems to have the power and they seem to need that partnership or engagement, should find the confidence, to walk away and find somebody else who aligns more, because you risk the chance that that partner may take you off your core mission. So you must stay true to your mission and your focus. You'll have some people that will come and say, oh, why don't you do it this way? Or why don't you do it that way? So make sure that you find that alignment. And the other thing that I'd like to say is we must hear more of the true impact on the ground, right? So I think as we're having these conversations and we're showcasing more of, the amazing work that's being done, I think it can also help to change the narrative that if we do that deeper dive, these are the results. So good news hopefully can spread if everybody keeps talking about it, such that funders can change their perspective on not just the numbers, but the story behind the number. So I think we should even change that. Not just 1,000, but who are the 1,000 people? What happened to them? So now let's move from numbers to the stories behind the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Very provocative question, Tatiana. What could we do Monday? And I can't really think of something that can be done Monday, but I'm inspired by Priya's answer. What do you tell your students? And what I tell my students, you tell them to push back. I tell them, do your homework. And I think it's very important that you, for us as people working on the field, not be focused on our experience, learn about what's happening outside. It gets very tempting to be absorbed in your own context, in what you're doing, and in your everyday. So I tell my students, read the most recent report. Don't go to meet a donor, or don't write your proposal not knowing what's happening in this field. Maybe you can stumble on the best experience in the field, but how does this experience relate to what's happening elsewhere? We're in Egypt. What's happening in India? Go learn about what's happening in other parts of the world. Not just be focused on your own context and be local in your thinking. You need to be global in your thinking. to have a local impact. So that's what I tell my students, and it's not something that could be finished on Monday. It probably takes the rest of the year, or maybe it's an advice for life, and not be fooled by all local successes, because sometimes people, would do an intervention, be very happy with it, it's fantastic, but what's happening outside? Why is your intervention successful? You need to see that.
Yeah, and maybe to build on the other good comments here, and maybe to speak to people, but to the entrepreneurs and everyone else, is basically to always give constructive feedback and try to open doors. Look at ways to give voices and say, okay, let me see how I can be helpful. And if you haven't read the latest report, then point to that, but encourage people to continue and not to give up. And I sometimes think about, you never know what role you play in other people's life. Maybe it's just something small you say, or something big. We all remember that one little conversation with someone that changed everything. So I think by listening carefully and giving others space and opportunity and courage, can at least push the needle a tiny little bit forward.
I guess on that as well, many of you, or I think basically all of you, in different forms have talked about failure and risk, and how that's deeply embedded into how we think about success, and how would you even imagine measuring that, let alone. So I don't know if any of you would be able to explain a bit more on maybe a way that we can integrate failure and risk into how we imagine what counts as success.
I don't think any big success or any success at all happens without loads of failures. I think it's a part of the journey of getting from A to B. So if you want to do something big, get used to getting no's from multiple stakeholders. But like Gata said, then you have to do your homework, and Priya said with her previous comments, or Regina, it's a journey, and you get to the end through a road that looks something like this. No success is a straight line.
We have these conversations first now because of social media. Everybody shares a lot of their success stories. So somebody said, if you log into LinkedIn, you'll have a heart attack, because each time you see, I just successfully did this, I closed this deal. Like, LinkedIn will break your spirit if you're going through entrepreneurship, because everybody just shares how they seal this deal, and then where there's this trend called from here I was then, here I am now. Nobody talks about, I received 10 no's, or I struggled with this, or I applied 10,000 times. So I think first we need to talk more about failure, so that it becomes normal, because everybody just sees the success and everybody thinks that's just it. Everybody just woke up and then the next thing they were there, so that a lot of young people can realize that even their mentors, or the people that they aspire to be, went through failure. The other thing is we use the word learnings a lot now. So instead of, we say, students, challenge yourself for a lot of learnings. And for us, that means we want you to fail so that you have a different approach. Not that we want you to fail intentionally, but we want you to try different things. So we push the idea that if you fail at something, it's a learning. And the more learnings you have, the better you are at doing something. So I think that would be the two feedback, that we need to also share more of the failing story instead of everybody glamorizing success like it happened overnight. And we need to challenge young people, and especially women, that learning is part of the journey. Like, if you're not learning a lot, or you're not failing, or you're not taking enough risk, you're not pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, and you're not growing. You can be doing good at what you do, but you stay small if you don't push yourself. So also with those narratives, I think that would be helpful.
Just to build off of what Regina is saying, and I love all of it and 100% agree. I think, and today I guess I just love talking about funders, but I think it's important for funders to think about what kinds of seed money they're providing women entrepreneurs specifically to continue learning like that. And so that's part of measuring impact, right? And part of allowing failure is thinking about what you're asking for from your entrepreneurs early on and allowing for that. That's really critical. And then the other piece that I think is important is just allowing for entrepreneurs to demonstrate failures, learning, success in different ways. So if that means that you are a mom and you have to work on your venture part-time initially and hold down your full-time job, so be it, right? If it looks different ways for different people, I think that we need to allow for that so that we have the range of ideas and a range of problems that are being solved by social entrepreneurs.
And I think because he asked me about academia in the beginning, I think it's the one advice that you need to give over and over to people joining the field of academia is that this is a field that thrives on rejection emails. You apply to a graduate program and you apply to many graduate programs and you get accepted once from one program or maybe two, but that other program is probably impossible to join. And then you try to publish. And I remember I showed my students a rejection email. I mean, the comments from the reviewers, and they were, you're showing us this. And I was like, it's important that I show this because unless you know that you have to live with that you get an email that the paper that you've been writing for months, laboring in writing it and putting all the energy, sleepless nights, you think it's a piece of art, and then it gets rejected outright from the journal because you chose the wrong journal or because it's not their area of interest or because the idea is not very interesting to them, or because they don't get it, because maybe you're too smart. Let's think of it this way. Maybe your paper is too smart and they're not getting it. But if it is one advice you want to give to people joining academia is that they have to build a tough skin, that failure should not break you. If I would go back, I would remember those sleepless weekends, sad days when you got the rejection email for a paper that you worked very hard on, a paper that you wrote for that specific journal in mind, and you just thought that they would take it, they would definitely take it. And then they don't take it. And then you're, have to redo it. And it's like all this work, it means nothing because it's an issue of impact. It wasn't accepted. So I think failure is one thing that you need to learn. It should not break you. You should be able to accept it, move on. Nowhere the case more than academia. And I've seen so many people who get broken by the failure. They stop. They don't continue publishing. They don't continue trying to publish because it's been very hard to be rejected. So thank you for bringing up that issue. It touches a real nerve in academia.
That hits a bit too close to home. It's like a bit harsh, but very real. I guess we just have 6 minutes left, but I did want to ask one more question, and then of course, if there's anything else they didn't get a chance to mention that you did want to mention, please use the last 5 minutes to do so. This one is a bit more around challenging the dynamics in research, where similar to a funder or similar with an academic setting, someone has come up with this kind of tick box exercise, as Regina was saying, where the questions are already been decided that might be completely irrelevant to the people being asked them or connected at all to any sort of impact that the research is saying that it might have. And there's this huge gap, and some of that can be mitigated through participatory research practices or research that's done in conjunction with different organizations, but oftentimes it comes a bit too late. So I wondered, do you have any experience or any examples of either challenging those dynamics or finding ways of kind of building those more participatory approaches? And again, I guess there's another aspect of this that's, oh, it's we can't find these people. And there's this kind of, oh, hard to reach narrative, when it's really up to the institutions to find ways of finding people that they are hardly reaching, right? So it's quite a challenging environment. But again, if you have any examples or experiences on how you navigate those dynamics, maybe we can close out with that.
So, sorry, go ahead. Okay. So for us, I think a lot of that is around user research and accessing users in the beginning phases of when students are launching their ventures. And I think that the key piece is that you cannot expect to kind of live within the frameworks of your walls and solve someone else's problems. So you need to do whatever it takes to kind of be where the people you're solving with are, embedding yourselves in their communities, going to where they are, which I know during the pandemic is not possible, but we found a lot of different tools and ways to do that, and adapting yourself to like other people's needs. And I think that it boils down to that. And even you know, during the pandemic, where it's really challenging to do remote design work, we found ways where, for example, if it's hard for a particular group of people in a community to log on to Zoom, do a phone call with them. You can send them different materials, so that like different things that you're prototyping with, in like snail mail, and then you can talk to them on the phone. So it's about, I think, really adapting to what your communities need and what works for them.
Maybe to build on your comments, Priya, we've had similar experience and been focusing on the same thing. We work a lot with indigenous communities across the Arctic, and I think, as you're saying, the general theme is, if you're doing research focusing on Greenland, you need to hire someone from Greenland to work with you on that research. If you're creating an educational program for local youth in the Arctic, you need to partner with local organizations and craft the program so it addresses the interest and needs of youth in that area. I think actually Zoom and in that case, and technology in general, has helped us prove how much of inclusiveness you can actually do with low cost now during the COVID time. And we have many more possibilities to do all kind of creative work in a much more inclusive way, because the excuse of not being able to get someone to campus is not valid anymore, and cannot be used. So those are examples of some methods and some projects that we've been focusing on. But as I mentioned earlier, just designing a strategic plan and being extremely intentional in inclusiveness in panels and education and so forth is our engagement strategy.
And I couldn't agree more. Participatory design approaches, and it's a shame that we're still talking about this as if it's something that we have to start thinking about. And it's just a shame, because, you know, for so many years, and millions of dollars have been spent on interventions designed in air-conditioned rooms, fantastic office settings to be implemented in remote areas where people have nothing to connect or to relate to. And I see donors a lot asking about, how did you engage the community in the design? And and I teach proposal writing and grant and fundraising, and it's like, what? So what are we going to write here? Let's think of something to write, and maybe we visited once, or we did this or the. But that's a shame, because it has to be much more than that. And the hierarchy within the development field, we need to have, Tatiana, you put that question at the end. But it's, this is a big question, because we really need to have the courage to talk about this, and the courage to acknowledge the hierarchy in the development field, in social enterprises. And we need to acknowledge that there are people who are subjects and objects in the development field, and this should not continue. It's been the case for centuries now, but this should not continue, and we have to be taking a very strong stance against it. But thank you for that question.
To follow on with what Hannah just said, to give an example. So recently we ran a national program, and I took time to go around the regions to hear from the women on the ground. And I was really surprised, because I think one thing that we forget is there's so much focus on maybe like capital places, or places where it's easy to get internet or connectivity, that you lose the voices of the women that are out there. And for the first time, it reminded me why we need to, for those that have the platform, we need to keep talking about these things, and we need to even push funders out of their comfort zones to really reach and go into those places where they can really drive impact. And so I really wanted to echo with what Hannah just said, to say, like, there are so many women in different conditions that we forget about. And it's easy to just do what is easy and focus on the capitals and just do these projects that bring a lot of visibility, but you don't want to take a bus and cross a river and jump it, to reach those women that where the impact would even be greater. And sometimes sitting in the air-conditioned room and designing these programs without the benefit of even the experience. So personally, going through that, I understood certain insights that I didn't understand when I'm sitting in the capital, and why the women behave in a certain way. You have to actually be there to get some certain things. So I think we have to push the conversation past where can we just reach in the comfortable areas? How do we lift up the voices of women everywhere? How are our programs more inclusive? And how do we push the envelope so that we can go to the hard to reach places and drive impact there?
Well, I think that's a perfect way, a perfect call to arms to finish the session on. Thank you, Regina, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're over by 3 minutes, so a bit sorry, but we're close. And especially a thank you to the WISE team and to Geneva and Claire, who did a lot of the background organizing for this panel. And yeah, thank you all for joining, and hope our paths cross again soon in the future of research and impact.